Welcome to our class. In this class, we will continue learning about the document object model. We have already learned that the document object model is a tree representation of the document in the form of nodes that have a parent-child descendant relationship. When we use JavaScript to hide or show or to display a message on the page, we first need to access that element or that location. We have learned different methods which will allow us to do that. We have looked at getElementById, which returns a reference to that object. We have also looked at getElementsByClassName, meaning we can access an element or elements having that same class name. GetElementsByTagName, where we can access an element or elements having that same tag name. And GetElementsByName. This is used with form elements, as form elements all have the name attribute in addition to an ID. It is most commonly used with radio buttons. GetElementsByClassName, GetElementsByTagName, GetElementsByName all essentially are returning a collection or an array of nodes. There also is the query selector method, which will take a CSS selector, any valid CSS selector. There is a query selector all method, which also takes a CSS selector. The query selector method will return the first match of that selector. For an example, here I have the class, my class. Notice that we are using a CSS selector as a parameter here. It is not the class name, it is actually the class, which is indicated by a period, as that is the syntax of the selector. So this will allow us to access the first match for that selector. Should you wish to return a node list, which is an array of all of the instances of that selector, you can use query selector all. When you use query selector with an ID, it will only return one match because IDs are unique. Notice again, we are using the CSS selector syntax, not the name of the ID. We also can use query selector all with tag names or with any valid descendant selector. Sometimes we need to move up or down the document, which is called traversing. And there are different ways that we can access things on the page. We have many properties. For example, the first element child, the first child, last element child, last child, next element child, next element sibling, which we have used, previous element child, previous element sibling. We also have a collection of the child nodes, which has a length property. Again, this constitutes an array. Therefore, we can access the individual child nodes array using the array index value in the brackets. We also have the children, which is a collection of all the children, again an array. We also have the parent element and parent node. So these are some additional properties that are not necessarily in this textbook, but are available through different resources provided. Another method of the document interface is AddEventListener. This essentially will do what onClick will do. It just does it a little bit differently. And as you can see, it takes two parameters. The first parameter is the name of the event, and the second parameter is the function that is being called. This allows us to essentially bind multiple events to the same function and to set up multiple event listeners for our application. I would also like to introduce you to the style property. This is more of a traditional JavaScript syntax. It's not necessarily the DOM, but you see it used in connection with the DOM in order to apply CSS styles. The CSS styles are not written in our traditional CSS syntax, but in the JavaScript syntax. So essentially, we eliminate the hyphen in the property name and we camel case the name of the property, as you can see here with background color. It is always more efficient to work with classes. However, you will see this being used occasionally. We have already learned how we can manipulate the DOM by creating elements and creating text nodes inside those elements, by appending those nodes using append child. We also can determine where we want to insert our nodes. We have the ability to replace nodes and to remove nodes. Again, there is additional resources to cover these methods. We will now look at some methods commonly used with forms. We have the submit method, and the submit method essentially calls the action of the form and sends the name value pairs to that action. We have the reset method, and technically you might think that this clears the form, and indeed it does. However, what it really does is it resets the values to the initial state. It is possible to initially set up a form with defaults in it, so reset would reset those values to the default. The focus method allows us to place focus. Commonly, we see the blinking I-beam cursor on the control, such as a text box. The blur method will remove that focus. And we have the select method that is used when we select the contents of a text box or a larger text area box. Some events commonly used with forms. We have the onSubmit event when the form is submitted, the onReset event when the form values are reset, the onFocus event when the control receives focus, the onBlur event when the control loses focus, the onSelect event when the user selects the contents of a text box or a text area, the onChange event when the value of a control changes, the onClick event when the user clicks on a control, and the onInput event when a control receives user input. We're very familiar with onClick, and we have been using that with buttons. However, you can use some of these other events within the form to dynamically look at the form and validate it as the user works through the form, as opposed to validating everything when the user clicks the button. We have also looked at the value property, which is used in determining the value of not only the text box and the larger text area, which is not shown here, but it will also return the value of a drop-down list, and the first option will be selected by default. We can also use the value property to return the value of the radio or checkbox only if it is checked. If it is not checked, it will not return a value. JavaScript also has the checked property that enables us to determine if a radio or checkbox is checked. It will return true if checked and return false if not checked. Remember that radio groups must all have the same name, and they will only return one value in the group. Finally, I would like to point out there is a lot of form validation code on the internet using the events that we have just discussed. You may commonly see developers using the onSubmit event handler inside the HTML form tag. This is traditional JavaScript, and you do not need to do it this way because you would do it using the document object model. You also will see a lot of onClick event handlers in buttons inside the input HTML element. Again, this is traditional JavaScript, and it should not be used in this class.